Good evening. Tonight we're sitting here with Mr. Eric Caren from the Caren Archives. We're going to speak a little bit of his collection as well as to who he is. Mr. Caren, would you like to give us a little bit of your credentials and your history, please?
Sure. Well, I run an archive called the Caren Archive. I've been a collector for as long as I can remember, over 40 years. And I started with everything typical like baseball cards and stamps, coins and fossils. But at the age of 11, I stumbled upon an abandoned house full of old newspapers. And we'll jump back, but jumping forward now, at this point, I maintain an archive of about 1 million historical items, hundreds of thousands of original newspapers dating back to the 16th century. And I'm a proud member of the Grolier Club, the American Antiquarian Society, the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America. I'm a former director of the Ephemera Society, and also the museum that opened up on Pennsylvania Avenue between the White House and the Capitol, which is a $500 million museum devoted to news. The majority of the nucleus of that collection was a collection that I sold to them to create the rest of the museum around.
Thank you very much, Mr. Caren. Can you tell us how you got started in detail, please?
Okay, well, after I discovered those newspapers as an 11-year-old, and by the way, at 11 years old, these things were several miles from where I lived, and I was just fascinated. They were in an abandoned house, and I literally would carry these things for 3-4 miles back to my home. As much as I could carry as an 11-year-old, I was just thrilled. At that time, my first page of a newspaper was from 1913, and the papers that I was carrying back from the house were, the oldest I think were from the late 1890s, but for an 11-year-old that was ancient history. I was a born and bred New Yorker, and I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if I could get some news on Babe Ruth? That first page was from 1913, so it was a little too early for Babe Ruth, but nonetheless it was fascinating, and that got me started going to antique shows, flea markets, attending collector fairs. These were the days before internet, so I was collecting basically in isolation for many years. I would look at old antique magazines, or I should say contemporary antique magazines, and I saw ads for people selling this kind of thing. I remember the first paper I purchased. I wanted to purchase one that was $7.50. That was too much for my $1 a week allowance, so I wound up purchasing for about $5 a paper that dated from 1771. And I remember there was an ad in there for what we call now quackery, a medical quackery. There was an ad for, believe it or not, an invisible medicine. And I thought, how much has changed? I started reading about wars and political corruption, and of course the ads sold remedies for everything under the sun, and certainly a lot of it was snake oil. But this just perpetuated this interest that I had and still have for rare newspapers. Basically every subject imaginable is covered in them. And of course in the early days there was not only no internet, there was no television, there was no radio. So the only means of mass communication, the only way that people found out what was going on in their world, domestically and internationally, was by either letter or by getting a newspaper. And they were cherished and treasured, so that people would get a hold of a paper and then pass it on from family member to friend to so on and so forth. And people were very eager to find out what was going on outside the little world.
Mr. Caren, could you please go into the history of newspapers?
Certainly. Well, newspapers really started not long after the invention of printing by Gutenberg in the mid-1400s. By the late 1400s, they were publishing irregularly issued news pamphlets. They were issued just when a major event took place. And actually, one of the holy grails of this sort of news book was the Columbus letter. something that has actually eluded me. There were different editions of it, but they were all rare, and it was essentially published in 1493, and in Latin or German detailed the discoveries of the New World by Columbus. Pretty much simultaneously, actually, with the development of irregular news books, we had what we call news broadsides. In German, the word is Flugblätter. Also, the English refer to them as broadsheets. And here is an example of a German news broadside from the 1570s showing the Spanish Fury. Basically a massacre by the Spanish troops of the Flemish people, and the brutality is shown in very, very graphic detail. And these news broadsides were remarkable in that oftentimes they were published fairly shortly after an event took place, and they really did try and get accuracy of reporting, focusing, of course, as you see here, on the graphics for a basically illiterate population, and then oftentimes putting the news itself underneath in rhyming verse, so that even if someone couldn't read, they could relate to the picture and see exactly what had happened according to the publisher of the broadside. Although I own the very earliest formal English language newspapers published in London in 1665, called the Oxford Gazette, and then later the London Gazette, I'm holding in my hands the very first successful American newspaper called the Boston Newsletter, which began publication in 1704 and was published right through the Revolutionary War. The circulation of this paper was extremely low, anywhere between 300 to maybe 500-600 newspapers. And so the survivability of any particular issue, of course, is very, very low. As you see, there were no illustrations in the first American newspaper. There were no headlines, and the newspaper was really only remarkable in that it was the first successful American paper. There had been one previous attempt in 1690 called Public Occurrences, and that was a single sheet paper as well, but that paper was suppressed by the government because basically, even at that early stage, the Crown of England was trying to control what the colonists in Massachusetts Bay understood about what was going on at home and abroad. And I'm holding in my hands now a very interesting little paper published in 1706 in Germany. I primarily collect English language and newspapers, American and British. However, I'm also interested in very unusual foreign language newspapers like this one. Most newspapers at this early stage were still not illustrated at all, and we see here on the cover a very large copperplate engraving of an Indian mogul. And this was published weekly, and every issue of this newspaper had a similar size engraving on the front page.